And so if you turn to the last bit of Deuteronomy chapter 3, again, each week I remind us of the whole message. Deuteronomy 6:23, which we're coming to, is the whole point of the book, which is, remember, God brought us out from there. What is the there? Egypt. That picture, that spiritual picture of bondage and slavery to sin. He brought us out from there to bring us in. But remember, they've been 40 years in the wilderness. And the kids could legitimately say, remember, God brought us out from there, Egypt, to this wilderness. Oh, no wonder their parents were talking about Egypt and going back and the onions and garlics, the leeks, etc., which we've talked about before. That's what they were talking about. And yet Joshua and Caleb had a different message. They were in the land. They spied it out for 40 days and 40 nights. They even brought some of the produce of the land. And they said, it's an exceedingly good land. We should go in. Those giants, the bigger they are, to say it more contemporary, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, And Caleb's name means dog. And it's kind of ironic. I've shared this before, and I've had parents come to me, we didn't name our child Caleb because it means dog. I know that. The idea of dog means loyalty. And that's what Caleb was. He was loyal to his God. He knew. So even at 80 years old, when he's finally allowed to go in, at 80, he's like, no problem. And he had 5 years of victory in the land, we're told in Joshua. And on his 85th birthday, Moses had made a promise to him 45 years earlier. And he said, guess what, Caleb? Every place on which the sole of your foot has trodden will be yours. And do you know where they had trodden those 40 days and 40 nights? In the hill country, where the giants were. So at 85 years old, Caleb comes to Joshua and says, hey, I want my inheritance. Can you imagine? 85 years old. He's crazy. He's in his wheelchair wheeling up. I want my inheritance. Those giants are going to see me coming. He's ready to go in at 85 years old, and he believes that God said it, so he would do it. It doesn't require if I'm mild out. I like how that imagery was that Cheryl said, if I'm mild out or not, God is able to do it. And then it says this in Joshua. It says this, very important. And then the land had rest. So what do you conclude happened with Joshua at 85 years old when he went to face the giants? God gave him the victory. The land had rest. See, it's not dependent on might or power or age or experience or location or geography or anything. It's dependent on God who says, this is what I want to do. And this is what we finished with last week. The Lord said, I will fight for you. I will fight for you. So the question always is, will I believe him? Will I believe him? And ultimately, as we go through this morning, this is the question. The fourth barrier to entering God's rest is compromise. But will I believe him? So, we looked at three barriers, these mountaintop experiences where they met God at Mount Horeb or Sinai, and they received the law. And it was a marvelous, wonderful experience, but God says, you can't stay there. It's a mountaintop experience, but you've got to move forward, remember? In faith, because the whole point of the law was to lead them to Christ, a tutor, so that faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the message of Christ. The law is the message of Christ. That's what Jesus says in John chapter 5. Moses wrote of me. So God knew in giving the law that they could have one of two choices. Independence, I can do it myself, or, this is about you. I need you in my life. And so faith should have been the product, but they didn't believe. The message they heard didn't profit them, we're told in Hebrews chapter 2, because it was not united with faith in those who heard it. So they had the same gospel message as we have heard, no different. That was the message of Christ through the giving of the law. So they had a wonderful mountaintop experience, but they didn't continue on in faith. The faith was ready to be enacted in their lives, but they didn't believe. Then the second mountaintop experience, remember Mount Seir or Esau, the place of Esau's inheritance. And that was a place of self-sufficiency. And they spent 38 years at that mountain in the wilderness. We are self-sufficient, even though in the wilderness it was impossible for them to sustain their lives. It was impossible. They knew that. That's why God's pillar of cloud and pillar of fire was there every moment of that time. And every morning they woke up and God provided manna for them. And it says their clothes never wore out. So even though he was angry with them for their self-sufficiency, he still took care of his people. And we're going to see in chapter 4 of Deuteronomy that Moses says this to the next generation. God is compassionate, and he will not forsake his covenant. Oh, that's amazing. So, you can't stay at Mount Horeb. You can't stay at Mount Seir, that place of self-sufficiency. And then last week, we looked at facing the giants. So coming off that mountain, they went into the land or the valley of the shadow of death. into the land of Moab. And remember Ammon and Moab? They were trying to preserve their life because of their fear of the giants. And God reminded the Israelites, I took care of Moab and Ammon and Esau, and in each of those places there were giants. And God says, look, I took care of those giants. The giants in Canaan, no big deal. I've got this. And that's how we finished in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 22. Do not fear them. So we're going to see later on today that there is a proper place and source for fear. But he says, do not fear them, the giants. For the Lord your God is the one fighting for you. So, aside from God, whom we're called to fear, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Just take a moment. What are you fearing? What are we fearing tomorrow, today, going forward? He says, do not fear them. I am the one fighting for you. So today we look at casting aside compromise. This is a huge barrier for entering rest. Remember, what's rest? A change of activity where we allow God to do what he promised to do in our lives. I will do it for you. As you face those giants, just like the giant of Egypt, that picture of bondage to sin, all they did was put their faith in the Lamb and God redeemed them. So, as I delivered you, I will bring you into the land of rest. So, let's read chapter 4. We're going to come back to chapter 3, verse 23 in a second, but we're going to chapter 4, verse 1. And now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the judgments which I am teaching you to perform, in order that you may live and go in and take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you. You shall not add a word to it of that which I am commanding to you, nor take away from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you. So, Moses is pleading with this next generation, because everyone 20 and over is not allowed in, so anyone 20 and under, he's pleading them, go in, but he gives them some instructions. First of all, he says, verse 1, O Israel, listen. Listen. As we read in Psalm 95, it says, today if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. Now the question is there a time where God doesn't speak? Now that's a rhetorical question, because we're told in Psalm 19 that God has been speaking since he started creation. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord. Day after day pours forth speech. Night after night reveals knowledge. There's never been a time where God has stopped speaking. It's kind of a misnomer when we say, okay, the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament is the silent period. Please note, God has never been silent. It's just the unrecorded messages period. Does that make sense? So there's 400 years of unrecorded messages between the Old Testament and New Testament. But it's not silent time. God has never been silent. Day after day, he pours forth speech. So as we read in Psalm 95, today, if you hear his voice. So what does that mean? Tomorrow, when you hear his voice. Don't harden our hearts. See, the cool thing, I always, like as I age, I'm confessing a little bit of weakness now. As I age, I think, oh man, I want to remember that. That was so, you see a TV show, or Daniel's been doing trivia with our family every Friday night, and I was like, oh, I want to remember that fact. And like an hour later, I was like, what was that fact I wanted to remember, But as a kid, I remember all the details, right? The smells, the aromas. I went and preached one time in Whitehorse, where I was born, in the church that's the first memory of a church I ever attended. So I went back to that church, the pastor that was there, he was showing me around. I walked into the church, and just the aroma, I was like, I'm home. As a child, it all came back to me. It's the same aroma that is in the old church there. So when I walked in, I was like, oh, I'm back in Whitehorse, See, as a child, all those memories are so fresh. Are we connecting? Does everybody understand that? As we age, like, oh, I want to remember that. What did I want to remember? And he says, listen, O Israel, listen. God is speaking, listen. Listen means to give attention to and to pay attention. Then he says this, listen and live. Listen, O Israel, to the statutes and the judgments which I am teaching you to perform, in order that you may live and go and take possession of the land. So what does God want? So this is what he wants for us. He doesn't want to wipe us out. What does he want us to have as believers? Not just being saved from Egypt. That's very important. Many Christians just are content with, well, God saved me from the bondage of sin, the penalty of sin, and that's where they live, in the wilderness. What does he want for them? He wants to give us a possession, an inheritance. So he says, listen, so that you may live and take possession of what God is wanting to give to you. When does that happen? Today. It will happen one day, like John Ball, when you pass away and Jesus takes you into his presence. That's an inheritance as well. But it's greater than that one day. It's today if you hear his voice. John didn't know when his today was, but he lived in a today, entering that rest. And so we need to recognize this, listen, so that we may live. Why? Because God wants us to live, truly live, and take possession of the land to which he's given us. So that means rest. So he's giving it to us. That means he's giving the rest to us. Not the rest of it, but the rest. He wants to do it for us. Remember Deuteronomy 3:22? I, the Lord, am fighting for you. He is doing it. So what's the instruction? Don't take anything away from it, and don't add to it. Don't take or add anything to it. That means don't compromise. So when Adam and Eve were in the garden, remember, God said, don't eat of the fruit. What did Adam say to Eve, or Eve said to the serpent? So we assume, because Eve wasn't there when that happened, when God gave the instruction to Adam. But what did Eve say to the serpent? God said, don't eat it or touch it. God never said don't touch it. Added to it. See, it was a good tree. God made it. It was a wonderful tree. He said, just don't eat it. Why? Because I want you to evidence a dependent relationship with me. And so Satan introduces a lie, and that introduces the compromise. And that's what we're living in now. The effects of it, as we were reminded yesterday at the funeral, the effects of a choice of independence. I can do it without God. So, don't add or take away. In other words, don't compromise. Learn from others' mistakes. The Bible, you may not like this, but the Bible's filled with mistakes, isn't it? People think, what? The Bible is inherent. There's no mistakes in the Bible. It's filled with them. David's a mistake. Moses is a mistake. There's lots of mistakes. People made lots of, and God preserves those mistakes for us. I'm not saying the scripture has mistakes in it. What I'm saying is God is using people in their mistakes. And so Moses gives a testimony of his own life, and then he gives a testimony of their parents, the people 20 and over, when they compromised God's instructions. So we're going to look at those two testimonies of compromise. First of all, Moses. What was Moses' compromise? Go back to verse 23 of chapter 3. Moses says, I also pleaded with the Lord at that time. Now, why is Moses pleading with the Lord? Look at this. This is so crazy because Moses is like an older person, like me. He forgot. He pleaded with the Lord, verse 24, O Lord God, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do such works as mighty acts as you? Now, Moses is nearing 120 years old, and he's just now saying, God, you've begun to show me your works. Did not God show his works 40 years earlier to him? And then 80 years earlier to him? And then when he was born, did he not, God, show his works to Moses? By saving him from the Nile? Moses has had a lifetime of seeing God's work in his life, but he, like me, is old and forgetful. You've just now begun to show me your works. Something different has happened to Moses. Whatever happened in this last period when they came off Mount Seir, and God gave them victory over Og, the king of Bashan, and Sihon, the Amorite king, when he gave them victory, those were giants. And Moses thought, oh, that's what God is like. See, we never really figure it all out, do we? Anyone think they got it all figured out? That's pride. See, Moses is at a place, it's kind of like, yeah, I know that he saved me from the Nile. I know that he used me to deliver Israel from Egypt. I know that he produced water from the rock, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a new thing. And this is what faith looks like. God, you've begun to show me your work. Wouldn't it be great tomorrow to wake up and have that kind of idea? God, you've begun to show me your work today. Wow, I want to enter in. But look what happened to Moses. He's a testimony of this compromise. Verse 25, let me, I pray, cross over and see this fair land that is beyond the Jordan, that good hill country and Lebanon. Did Moses say anything about giants at this time? God, let me go see those giants. No, what is Moses focused on? I want to see this fair and good, lovely land that you've made for us. See, that's what God wanted Israel to see at the very start. He didn't want them to see the giants. There were giants there, but what did he want them to see? It's a good land. It's a spacious land. It's a land that flows with milk and honey. Moses is starting to see that. But look at this. Verse 26, but the Lord was angry with me on your account, and he would not listen to me, and he said to me, enough. This is like dad speaking. You ever had that? Please, 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 please. You ever done that? I'm the only one, right? And dad finally says, enough. And he says it in that tone, and you know, if you say one more please, you're in trouble. That's what God is saying, enough. Speak to me no more of this matter. Go up to the top of Mount Pisgah, or Nebo, and lift up your eyes to the west and the north and the south and the east, and see it with your eyes, for you shall not cross over this Jordan, but charge Joshua and encourage him and strengthen him, for he shall go over at the head of the people, and he shall give them the inheritance of the land, which you shall see. And we remained at the valley opposite Beth Peor. So they're at 38 years. They have to wait a couple more years for who to die? Moses. This is a sad, sad story. Moses is not allowed into the land of rest, even though today he's like, wow, God, you've begun to show me your greatness and your power. I want to go. And God says no. Why? Well, from Numbers chapter 20. Again, you can just note it, but I'll read a few verses out of Numbers chapter 20. It's as Israel is in the wilderness, they ran out of water again. Now, there's two stories, just in case you think, I thought Moses was supposed to strike the rock. There's two times when Moses was the people were without water, and the first time God said to Moses, take the staff that's in your hand and strike the rock. He says, I myself will stand on that rock while you strike it. And Peter says that is the picture of Christ. He was wounded for our healing. So God stood on that rock and Moses struck it, and water came out, and they all drank and were satisfied. But they ran out of water again, and this is the second time now. So in Numbers chapter 20, it says this, then the sons of Israel, the whole congregation, so this isn't just some of them, this is everybody. Can you imagine how difficult this would have been? Everybody is against you. Not some people, not a few dislikes on YouTube, everybody. The whole congregation came to the wilderness of Zin from the first month, and the people stayed at Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried. And there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves against Moses and Aaron. Thus the people contended with Moses, saying, if only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why then have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness for us and our beasts to die here? Now, they're making an assumption. What is the assumption? God brought them there. Yeah, Moses brought them there, and they're going to die. Now, what do we know about the wilderness? They were sustained in the wilderness for 40 years because there was water, because there was food. No, they were sustained in the wilderness. Why? Because God sustained them. That's why. There's no other explanation. But they're blaming Moses for the deficit in the wilderness. Verse 4. Verse 5. Why then have you made us come up from Egypt to bring us into this wretched place, and not to the place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranate, nor is there any water to drink? Then Moses and Aaron came in from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the rod which you and your brother Aaron assemble the congregation and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it may yield its water. A rock producing water? You shall thus bring forth water from out of the rock, and let the congregation and their beasts drink. So Moses took the rod, so he's obeying. He took the rod, just as the Lord had commanded him, and Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock. So they're all coming to this rock. All right, everybody, gather near. And every one of them have past experience. What happened? Oh, when we were out of water one time, I know we complained and grumbled, but Moses struck that rock and water came out. So maybe they're anticipating that. So they gathered them together, and look what Moses does. Listen now, you rebels. He's a fiery preacher now. Listen, you rebels. Shall we bring water forth from this rock for you? Who's doing it? God, not Moses. See, Moses is replacing God, and when you replace God as God in your life, you compromise God's instructions. Moses is taking the place of the Lord in his life. Shall we bring water from this rock? Then Moses lifted up his hand and he struck the rock twice. So one time was good, but twice must be better. And water came forth abundantly. Nobody's the wiser. And everyone drank and they were satisfied. Verse 12, but the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you have not believed me today, if you would hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. At Meribah, this is where they're at. Don't harden your hearts. Moses failed, the most humble man that ever lived, failed to enter the land of rest. For you did not believe in me to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel. Therefore, you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. Those were the waters of Meribah, because the sons of Israel contended with the Lord, and he proved himself holy among them. So even though Moses replaced God as God in his life, God still established his holiness. So here's the compromise. He was pressured with his circumstances. Of course, none of us are pressured by our circumstances ever, are we? See, this is when the fear and the worry to enter and compromise God's instructions. Pressure. So the pressure of circumstances come. Everybody's against me. And then he has an anger response. We're told to be careful because often the anger in our lives does not fulfill the will of God. So he says, be careful of that. There is a righteous anger, but most of the time the anger is our own flesh because God isn't doing what we think he should do. Now, because Moses had past experience, he took that staff, struck the rock twice. But what did God say? I want you to trust me. Speak to the rock. Trust me. Isn't that great? I love it that in the New Testament that Jesus healed a blind man 3 different ways. I think it's for the same principle. Because not a method, folks. It's a person that we're following, not a methodology. And so God says, don't strike the rock this time. Speak to the rock. In other words, Moses, trust me. Trust me. And in the pressure of the circumstances and his angered response, he struck the rock, and what happened? He entered into disobedient unbelief. And from his unbelief, he failed to enter rest. So even when he wanted to enter rest, God said, no, you cannot go in. Why? Because you treated me as unholy. See, God is always holy. He's always separate from everything that he has made. That's what makes him holy. But then he says this of us, you shall be holy as I am holy. What makes us holy? His presence in us. That's what makes us holy. God's presence, because he is holy and he is in us. So, learn not to compromise by watching this great leader Moses take note of his testimony. We're told, and I mentioned this, God called Moses the most humble man that ever lived, a man in which a man speaks to his friend face to face. God and Moses were friends, and yet God said, Moses, my friend, you are not allowed in to the land of Canaan. Now, just in case you're overwhelmed by that, because some people read the book of Hebrews and think, well, that you lose your salvation. If Moses lost his salvation, then there's no hope for Moses, then there's no hope for us. But what happened? 2,000 years later, Moses and Elijah appear in Canaan on the Mount Tabor, right? On the Mount of Transfiguration. So Moses got in just a couple thousand years late. Is that okay? Just so you know. But God was angry with him because it was God's testimony at stake, not Moses's. Moses replaced God in his testimony. Second testimony, go into chapter 4 now of Deuteronomy. The second testimony is Baal Peor. Baal is the Moabite god. So in chapter 4, verse 3, your eyes have seen, Deuteronomy 4, verse 3, seen what the Lord has done in the case of Baal Peor. For all the men who followed Baal Peor, the Lord your God has destroyed them from among you. But those who held fast to the Lord your God are alive today, every one of you. See, I have taught these statutes and judgments, just as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do thus in the land, not the wilderness, but in the land to which you are entering to possess. So these commandments and statutes and judgments are for the land of Canaan, not for the wilderness. So then, keep and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of all the people who will hear these statutes and say, surely this is a great nation and a wise and understanding people. Whoa. So, what is the testimony of Baal Peor? Again, for summary, it's Numbers chapter 22 to 25, so take heart, we're not reading those chapters. But in chapter 25, we read this. The Israelites saw the Moabite women, and they said, "Ugga, ugga, we like those women." And they started marrying those women, and those women had a little catch. Even though they were beautiful, there was a little hook. You know what that hook was? They had idols that they worshipped. And those idols became the Israelites' idols. And so they saw these women, and they married them, and these women brought these idols, this idolatry, into Israel, and they started to play the harlot with God. Instead of worshiping God, they worshiped Baal Peor, the idol of Baal, in the Moabite territory. Now, where did this all come from? How did they fall from this? Well, if you know in Numbers chapter 22, remember the story of Balaam's donkey? So we have Balaam, we have Balak, and we have Baal Peor, okay? So they're all different people. So Balaam is a prophet, and he was asked by Balak, the king of Moab, to come in and curse God's people. Now, he tried. You remember the donkey that prevented his path and saved his life by speaking? Amazing stories, right? And so God finally said, okay, your heart is set on going. Even though you say the words, "God won't allow me," your heart is set on going. So go, but you're only going to be able to speak what I let you speak. So 3 times, he's called by Balak to curse God's people. And as he goes out and starts speaking, he starts blessing God's people. And Balak is really mad. And so he does this 3 times. You think Balak would get it through his head. But the 3rd time, there's a wonderful blessing through chapter 24 that Balaam pronounces on the people of Israel. And here's what to note about Israel. They didn't even know they were in trouble. They didn't even know they were going to be cursed. They're living in disobedience, wandering around in the wilderness, and they didn't even know that they're actually in a lot of trouble. And God protected them in the land of Moab. So Balaam says this to Balak, and it's referred to later in the New Testament. Balaam says, "You know what? I cannot curse God's people. I can only bless them. But if you really want to get them," I'm paraphrasing, "if you really want to get them, bring your beautiful women into their midst. They're going to go, ugga, ugga, and they're going to marry them. And guess what? Your gods will become their gods, and that will displease the God of heaven and earth, and they'll be in trouble." So Balaam couldn't curse them, but he could introduce compromise into their lives. And that's what Moses says. Be on guard for my life. I compromise God's instruction, but be on guard for those people who played the harlot with the relationship they had with God. They compromised his instructions by intermarrying with the people that he didn't want them to marry. Why? Because those people's gods would become Israel's gods, and they would forsake the living God. So, they intermarried with the Moabites, idolatry, and this angered God. And it says in chapter 25 that 24,000 men died that day. So, Moses says, learn the lesson. Compromise leads to God being angry. That's why it says, today, if you would hear his voice. Well, now we have the testimony of Moses, we have the testimony of the people that were living in disobedience, compromising God's instructions. What about my testimony? So, and we don't have time to read all of chapter 4, but I just want to highlight a few things. What is our testimony? And Moses tells us, others are observing our lives. This is our testimony. Others are watching us. So he says, verse 6. So, Deuteronomy 4, verse 6. So keep and do them, for that is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples who will hear these statutes and say, surely this is a great nation, is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there who has a God so near to as the Lord our God whenever we call upon him? Or what great nation is there that has statutes and judgments and as righteous as the whole law which I'm setting before you today? Folks, just like people need to learn from Moses, people are learning from us. They're watching our lives. So we have a testimony. And so what is that testimony? We're on display for people to come to understand who God is. I've often said, we may be the only Bible that anyone, unbelievers ever read. We might be the only Bible. What are they reading about? Oh, these people grumble and complain. Their God must not be strong enough. Oh, these people are filled with immorality. Their God must not be satisfying enough. You fill in the blanks of your struggle in compromise. See, what are people observing in our lives? Are they seeing the sufficiency of a God who says, I want to give you rest? Are they seeing that? Very convicting, isn't it? We're on display. We don't give our testimony, we are a testimony. We often told the students on Friday night when you go out on street evangelism, you're not giving your testimony. What you are is you are a testimony. What will they see? Be careful not to forget. So verse 9, only give heed to yourselves, keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things which your eyes have seen. So in our testimony, we need to take time and be careful not to forget. Forget what? Forget what God has done in our lives. And again, just for the sake of time, I'd encourage you to read, because God reminds them of how he took care of the Amorite king and the king of Pharaoh in Egypt. And he says, you know what? I brought you out. I did it. So maybe today, what might be the most helpful thing today, as we got some time, is say, Lord, I just want to be reminded of your work in my life. What have you done? I want to remember that, because there's a purpose for it. You need to teach and tell the next generation. He says, verse 10, remember that the day you stood before the Lord at that time, verse 9, only give heed to yourself, keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things which you have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life, but make them known to your sons and to your grandsons. Remember when you stood before the Lord at Horeb. So we need to take time to remember what God has done in our lives. Why? Because we need to pass it on to the next generation. All of us have not just physical people like children or grandchildren in our lives, but we have spiritual people that are watching our lives. That's the next generation, and we need to pass it on to them. So what are we passing on to them? Well, only what God has done in our lives. It's the testimony of Christ. So teach the generation, and if you read on from verse 15, watch yourselves carefully, since you did not see any form on Mount Horeb. So be careful, because when God showed up at Mount Sinai, he didn't show up in a visible person. It was fire. That's all they saw. And they heard him speak, and they were very much afraid. So he says, here's your testimony. Watch out for idolatry. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. And so we need to be careful of the things that replace God in our lives. That's idolatry. Very important to note. Remember, everything that God has made is good. So what is that which is made which is good? When does it become a place of sin in our lives? It's all about focus, right? Everything that God has made is good. He just didn't make it to be worshipped. So God says later in Deuteronomy, he says, when I bring you into the land and you live in houses you never built, and you eat food that you never planted, and drink from vineyards that you never took care of, be careful, because you'll take your eyes off me and onto the blessing. The blessing is good, but it's just not to be worshipped. That's called idolatry. So in this idea of idolatry is repeated over and over in the book of Deuteronomy. So what does that tell us? Idolatry is a problem in our lives. So what things that we replacing God with in our lives that are good things that he has done? Has that become idolatry to us? Again, I think about this last year. There's been a lot of idols that have been cropped up in our lives, right? I'm the only one? Family has been an idol. For me, family's been an idol. Good, I'm glad, so thankful for a family, but family became an idol. Coming together is an idol. Nothing wrong with it, but it's not the source of our life, right? Focus on the government becomes many people's idols. We need to focus on the Lord today if you would hear his voice. I'm saying things not for your sake, but for my sake. I'm confessing of the idols that crop up in my life that are taking precedent over my focus on Jesus. So if you're under conviction, it's just because I'm under conviction, okay? So no worries there, right? But think good things that are replacing God as your object of worship and trust. Watch out for idolatry. For God is faithful to his covenant. This is a two-edged sword. He says in verse 22, not if, but when you forsake me and worship idols. He doesn't say if, he says when. And who's he speaking to? The generation under 20. So the children are going to get into the land of Canaan. He says, in time, you're going to have idolatry in your life. He doesn't say if, but when. And he says, and God, because he loves his land so much, he's going to pluck you off the land, and he's going to send you into heathen land. You can't go back to Egypt. You're going to go to Assyria and Babylon. And you know what? You can practice your idolatry there. You can read it. That's chapter 4. So you want idolatry in your life? He doesn't say if. He says when you have idolatry, God will simply remove you from his land and put you in the idol land, if you like. If you want idolatry, no problem. I'll give it to you. And you can worship your idols, not on my land, but in the foreign land. But then he says this, and then you'll turn to me. He says, and then you'll turn to the Lord, and the Lord will be compassionate, and he'll remember his covenant, and he will not forsake you. Isn't that amazing? See, he's giving them all the information before they even get there. I'm so thankful for that because there's no surprises with God. God isn't shocked when I disobey him, when I compromise instructions. He's not shocked. Is he angry? Yes. But is he shocked? No. Does he provide a way back? Yes. God loves us. So, God is faithful, that two-edged sword. He's faithful. If you want idolatry in your life, no problem. Do it not on my time or my land. But when you're in the enemy land, you're going to turn to me, and I'm going to be faithful to you and bring you back. Wow, thank you. So that's chapter 4, verse 15 to end of 31. So lastly then, here's the whole point. Why do we need to listen to him today? Because God alone is to be worshiped. Verse 32, God alone is to be worshiped. Indeed, ask now concerning the former days which were before you, since the day God created man on the earth. So Moses says, hey, think back to God creating the whole earth. Look at this. And inquire from one end of the heavens to the other. Has anything been done like this great thing, or anything been heard like this? And you're saying, what great thing? What did he do? Well, he goes on to say, has any people heard the voice of God speaking from the midst of a fire as you have heard it and survived? See, when they heard God speaking in a fire, they didn't say, on Mount Sinai, they didn't say, hey, we're great people. Isn't this cool? God is speaking with us. We're so special. You know what they said? They plugged their ears and said, God, don't speak to us any longer. If you do, we're going to die. And God said, that's the response I'm looking for. Fear me, not them. Fear me. And so, has anything been done where God spoke to people in the midst of the fire? Has anything like that ever been done and you survived? Whew. Verse 34, or has a God tried to take for himself a nation from within another nation by trials and signs and wonders, by war, by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and great terrors, as the Lord your God did before you in Egypt, before your eyes? Who was our master before we came to Christ? The evil one, right? He's the prince of the power of this air. He was in control, he was in charge, and God took us from that nation, we're children of wrath, and he brought us into a new kingdom. Has anything like that been done? See, this is our testimony. This is why God is to be worshiped, because I brought you from a nation of children of wrath, Ephesians chapter 2, and I brought you into a new people, a new nation, into a new family. I did this. Verse 35, to you it has been shown that you might know that the Lord, he is God, there is no one besides him. Out of the heavens, he will let you hear his voice to discipline you, and the earth will let you see his great fire, and you heard his words from the midst of the fire. Because he loved your fathers, therefore he chose their descendants after them, and he has personally brought you, so what does it say? He personally brought you from Egypt. He did it by his great power, driving out from before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in and give you their inheritance, give you their land for an inheritance, as it is today. Know therefore and take to your heart that the Lord, he is God in heaven and above and on earth below. There is no one other. So you shall keep his statutes and his commandments, which I'm giving you today, and that it may go well with you and your children after you, that you may live long on the land, and the Lord your God is giving you for all time. So, why is God to be worshipped? Firstly, because he acts on our behalf. It's very simple. He did it. Secondly, because he speaks to us. Think of the things that we put our trust in, those idols in our lives. Do they speak to us? No, we make inanimate objects speak to us, but that's just our own imaginations. They don't speak, they're inanimate. But God speaks to us. He is to be worshiped alone because he rescues us. He rescues us. He's to be worshiped because he wants us to know him. He lets us know him. Isn't that wonderful? We can know God's thoughts. I don't know if Einstein actually said it, but it's credited to him. He says, I want to know God's thoughts. The rest are just details. I don't know if he said that, but it's a cool thing. His pursuit is to know God. He wants us to know him. And next, God is to be worshiped because he disciplines us. The word discipline means to correct our thinking so that we might participate in his holiness. That's Hebrews chapter 12. God disciplines us. Discipline is for children. Often at Cape on Sunday night, there'd be a worship time, and then there'd be a testimony time, and people would be, I want to give thanks for this and thanks for this. And I said one time to the students, are you thankful for God's discipline? They're like, ooh, I don't know if I'm thankful for that. Discipline is one of the only verifications that we are his children, because God only disciplines children. So I would encourage us to be thankful for discipline, because it's a proof that we're his children. Because he doesn't discipline unbelievers. He disciplines his children, that we might participate in his holiness. Sum it all up, we worship him because there is no other God besides him. There's no other God besides him. So, big assignment this week. As we cast off compromise, and only the Holy Spirit, and like when Moses struck the rock twice instead of speaking to it, none of the people were the wiser except Moses and Aaron. God, Moses, and Aaron knew that Moses had disobeyed and compromised God's instructions. So, only you and I know what God is convicting us of the compromise in our lives, the things that are replacing him. Change our mind, come back to him, put our faith today. If you hear his voice, trust him, and then experience that there's no other God besides him, so that the world can see the testimony of God. Wow, this is a wise people. Who is there of all the people in Wetaskiwin that has a God so near to them that whenever they call upon him, he answers them? He does works in their lives. He rescues them. This is what we have, folks. Isn't that wonderful? Here's the finish. There's a memorial stone on Mount Nebo today that we visited in 2016. I wept on this mountain. This is Mount Pisgah or Nebo, and there's a monument there. Because if you read the very last chapter, Deuteronomy 34, Moses pleaded once more, and God says, forget it. Come up to the mountain, you can see. And you know what God showed him? He showed him the whole land of Israel, not Canaan, Amorites, Hittites, Hivites. He showed them the land of Israel, Naphtali, Dan. He showed them it's what it literally says. He didn't show them where the Amorites were living. He showed them this is where Israel is living. And it says, and Moses died on that mountain. He was 120 years old, and he, it says, had strength for fighting, for going in and going out. He was not yet old. He was 120 years old and not old. He could still fight, but he died there. And it says this, and God came down and buried his friend in a grave nobody knows. It's a sad story. I shared a devotional on that mountain, and I just wept. Because it was so real. See, when I read it in Deuteronomy, I think, oh yeah, Moses disobeyed God. But when you're actually there, and Moses is pleading to go into the land of rest, and God says no, it was very hard to take. Because it says, let us fear, lest any one of us should fall short of it. If Moses failed, what about us? So, today, if you would hear his voice, don't harden your heart. Enter into rest. Let's pray.